Everyone, my name is Chris Schlegel, and like everyone here, I'm a graduate student. We study English and education, and we're here at Harvard University's Bach Center for Teaching and Learning. We're in the Learning Lab, and we're very lucky today, I think, to be talking about Anecdote of the Jar by Wallace Stevens. But before we get to that, I'm going to start over here and ask people just to introduce themselves.
So I'm Mary Sue Dowd.
I'm Mike.
I'm Ezra Feldman.
I'm Michael Allen.
Michael has prepared some thoughts on it, and it has to do with an intertext that Michael over on this side introduced. So I wonder, Michael, if you'd feel comfortable talking a little bit about that.
Sure, and I guess just to introduce it, so the other, I think, quite important and strong intertext here is John Keats' poem "Ode on a Grecian Urn," which I'm sure everyone has encountered at some point or in some way. O Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou, silent form, dost tease us out of thought as doth eternity. Cold pastoral, when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on earth, and all you need to know. So,
Gets me every time.
Yeah, I know, it works. It still works.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things, I think there's a lot to talk about in the relationship between these two poems. We should think about how is a jar different, possibly more American than an urn. But I think the other thing to think about is what is the outside of the poem. So I didn't read the whole poem, but really the only thing that we know that's going on in Keats's poem, the only thing we hear about the world that he's describing, because this is part of a genre called ekphrasis, where you describe artworks in a different genre. So you might describe a painting in a poem. That's usually how it works. We do get a little glimpse outside of the poem, and that is just this idea of when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man. So you have the idea of the world going on and getting worse in some sense and dying away, and the urn speaking. So I wonder, is there an outside of the jar or an outside of the poem that's being gestured at?
I mean, yeah, it seems central to the comparison between the two. One thing I might venture is if, again, to talk about how light is guided into and I think flung away from the jar, which was something Mary Sue introduced. Let's imagine that the speaker, let's call him Wallace, but he could be anyone, is standing in a field looking at a jar. It's not inconceivable that there could be an image or a refraction of light such that there is a face of that person looking at the jar that becomes a part of the jar, right? That's a kind of phantasm of what's actually happening in Keats, right? Where you have figures on the urn. And I wonder if this, in some ways, is a poem for an age when even the notion of imprinting the image on the object itself, or believing that the image on the object is going to outlast all the other stuff that's being bulldozed and, turned into shopping outlets or whatever's happening around it in Tennessee, that would remain. That seems to be called into question here, right? What we have remaining is the jar, the blankness or the emptiness, the gray bareness that remains, where the image might be fleeting but can't be sort of imprinted on it. Like, I wonder if that's part of it.
I just, to build on that idea, I think for Keats, one of the great values of the urn is that it contains the ode, and that the actual artistic creation is a reflection of this higher order principle or essence, that truth is beauty, beauty is truth. That's all you need to know, right? That it's reflecting a kind of larger moral, spiritual law, which itself is, in a poem like by Shelley in Mont Blanc, he says the secret strength of things which governs all thought, right? This sense of there being a higher law that's informing poetry. And here I think we see a reversal of that in a somewhat ironic way, right? I mean, this is a literal jar. The Dominion is a pun, right? There's a brand of jars called Dominion jars that Stevens is actually placing in the wilderness, right?
That's great.
So it's kind of ironically playing on that and saying, actually, it's not so much essence, but it's experience, right? It's the way in which the jar interacts with the environment, and actually, in the poem, is essentially not killing it, but definitely not flourishing in a way that's positive. You know, it doesn't give a bird or bush. It's gray and bare. Right?
Yeah.
It's a sense of.
Well, Go ahead.
Well, it makes me think also that the difference between the Grecian urn, which would have to be made by an individual, and the jar, which we presume
Right.
is mass-produced,
Right.
is then reflected in the fact that the Grecian urn, in virtue of having the figures painted on it, gets to speak in Keats's poem,
Right,
right?
right,
It turns
exactly.
around. That
Yeah.
that whole notion, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that's not spoken in the voice of the poet.
No, it's in
Right.
It's
quotes.
the
It's a
urn
quote on the urn,
speaking,
right,
Yeah.
yeah.
right? Whereas this jar is clearly not the kind of thing that's going to get to speak in
Right.
virtue of being,
Unless-
as you said,
Right.
Yeah.
right there.
Right, unless the anecdote of the jar is anecdote by the jar,
By the
which I
jar.
think we've argued is
Yeah.
probably not
It's
the
not
case,
probably.
right?
But like
It's a
I think
different
I think it comes back to our question of. I
Of,
really think
yeah.
I think it's important, and I wanna
Of.
stand up for the speaking jar and the speaking urn, because I think even if we say, well, it can't really be speaking, this is too subconscious of the fact that, you know, after the Romantics, we're too subconscious of the fact that everything we put in art is something that we put there, and so we find what we expect to find.
Mhm.
I think there's still a yearning for to create objects that can say things that we can't say themselves, that we can't say ourselves, that we can't believe. So you talked about the fact at the end of Ode in a Grecian Urn is in quotation marks. You know, art objects are things that can say beauty is truth, truth is beauty, and believe it.
Yes.
Like human beings
Yeah.
are not like that. And,
Right.
and I think
That's the negative capability in a different angle, right?
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's the emptiness, right? If that the poet can create the poem that speaks beyond in some way, speaks into the unknowing of that.
And I'm very struck by one of the first things you said, Chris, which was about how this is a poem about the imagination, and about how different objects relate in the world, and about the pleasures of the imagination. But it's also about feeling. There's a kind of passage through different feelings, and so if this is in Ars Poetica, if it's a description of how you make art in the world, it's beautiful and powerful because that description is linked to what it feels like to fail to perhaps get everything you want out of that experience.
I like to imagine Keats as having anticipatorily plagiarized this poem. Keats knew that Stevens was going to write this poem, right? Stevens has rewritten Keats. So there's a kind of bidirectionality of influence here, right? Of course, we know historically that it could have only gone one way, but after having read Stevens, I don't think we can see the Keats in the same way. I don't want to give myself the last word, so Michael, take it away. You have the last word.
Oh. Well, I think just to build on that concept of the bidirectionality of influence, but to kind of move it across different mediums, I think, you know, there are other sort of forms of modern art that are going on at the same time that maybe are not identical, but that are similar to the sort of questions this poem is asking. You know, Duchamp, for example, you know, putting a
I
urinal.
placed a urinal
Exactly,
in a
right.
museum.
In the museum.
His
It's
famous
saying-
anecdote of the
exactly,
urinal.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. And having this concept of the ready-made, you know,
Yes.
taking these manufactured objects and
Yes.
putting them on display in art, and that
To
act-
recontextualize.
Exactly, to
Yeah.
recontextualize and to make us actually wonder, well, what is the role of art?
Well, yeah, I think this has been a really great conversation, and now
Thank
we'll
you.
recontextualize it by
Right.
putting it online.
Exactly.
Thanks, everyone.
It's such a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Yeah, it was
That was
great.
really fun.
Thanks.